Hey everybody, this is chapter 6 of the Bolshevik Party in Conflict, the Left Communist Opposition of 1918 by Ronald I. Kowalski. Chapter 6 is titled Politics and the State. The clash between the left communists and Lenin that surfaced in the spring of 1918 over how the revolutionary state was to be constructed rather predictably mirrored the strands of the conflict already examined. Again, the left communists accused Lenin of reneging on the libertarian political principles which, as Lenin had argued repeatedly during 1917, the revolutionary state must be founded. They viewed with horror his preparedness to abandon his program and to condone the reconstruction of a highly centralized, bureaucratic, dictatorial state to eliminate the chaos and anarchy that threatened the very survival of the infant Soviet Republic. They were certain that his betrayal of the vision of 1917, described by Robert Daniels as the dictatorship of the proletariat in the form of a commune state administered from below by the workers themselves, could lead only to the degeneration of the revolution. One problem which arises in attempting to disentangle this particular debate between Lenin and the left communists, and a problem which they had to grapple as a matter of political strategy, was that their mentors, Marx and Engels, had bequeathed them with no unequivocal blueprint for the construction of the revolutionary state. In fact, Marx and Engels' writings on the state were both contradictory and sketchy, as Tony Pallant wryly comments, lacking, quote, any rigorous exposition of the institutions of an emancipated society, end quote. One interpretation of their thinking, then dominant among the socialists of the Second International, was that it was possible to employ the existing state in the construction of socialism. Based essentially on the message of the Communist Manifesto, the task of the proletariat was, quote, to win the battle of democracy and, quote, to raise itself to the position of ruling class, end quote. Having done so, Marx and Engels apparently envisaged that the working class should employ the coercive organs of the state to crush opposition from the bourgeoisie and proceed to lay the foundations of the socialist economy and society of the future. Ultimately, quote, when in the course of the development, class distinctions have disappeared, and, quote, the need for a state of any sort, including a strong centralized dictatorship of the proletariat, would vanish, they believe, since the state, quote, political power, is merely the organized power of one class for the oppression of the other, end quote. However, the, quote, founding fathers, end quote, had left their followers an alternative vision of the revolutionary state. In the preface to the 1872 German edition of the Communist Manifesto, following, quote, the practical experience, end quote, of the Paris Commune, quote, where the proletariat for the first time held power for 2 whole months, end quote, they concluded that no longer could, quote, the working class simply lay hold of the ready state machinery and wield the ready-made state machinery for the working class's own purposes, end quote. In other words, the existing state could be employed neither to suppress the old ruling class nor to build a new socialist society. On the contrary, it must be destroyed root and branch. In particular, the standing army and the police, the essential purpose of which was to ensure the continued subjugation of the exploited majority of the population, were to be abolished. They were to be replaced by a popular militia, the people in arms, which alone could crush counter-revolutionary opposition. Similarly, the bureaucracy was to be dismantled and the work of administration thoroughly democratized. Democratically elected representatives of the working population were to be granted the power to make and implement laws, that is, to combine the legislative and executive functions which had remained separated in the old state. Presumably, Marx believed that this fusion of powers would contribute to the destruction of the bureaucratic professionalism characteristic of the old order, as to quote Richard Hunt, quote, government by bureaucracy gave way to the authentic self-administration of the people, end quote. To ensure further against the recrudescence of bureaucratism, quote, the officials of all other branches of the administration, end quote, were also to be elected and responsible to the people, and, as with the elected representatives, subject to instant recall. Lastly, all were to be paid only an average worker's wage to eliminate, it was hoped, the material bases of bureaucratic careerism. Consistent with the emphasis on popular participation in the administration of the revolutionary state, power was to be decentralized into the hands of a myriad of local communes, yet a central government of sorts, apparently to be composed of representatives from these communes, would remain necessary to carry out, quote, the few but important functions which still would remain for it, end quote. What these functions were was never fully defined by Marx, but it is probable that the most important would be the central role of the economy, quote, the central control of the economy, quote, to regulate national production upon a common plan, end quote. Finally, as Paulhan again remarked, for Marx and Engels, the commune state so organized was no longer, quote, a state in the proper sense of the word, end quote, conceived chiefly as an organ of coercion, of, quote, bodies of armed men, and, quote, separate from the people and historically employed by the ruling minority to suppress the majority. The commune, in which the vast majority of the people itself would exercise all coercive functions, would be quite different from all hitherto existing states. All remained vestiges of traditional state power, as Engels argued in his 1891 preface to Marx's The Civil War in France, were to be, quote, lopped off at once as much as possible until such time as a generation reared in new, free social conditions is able to heap the entire lumber of the state on the scrap heap, end quote. Engels. That Marx himself never literally equated the commune with the dictatorship of the proletariat is well established. It fell to Engels to do so, again in his 1891 preface. Impatient at the, quote, superstitious reverence, end quote, in which many German social democrats, quote, social democratic Philistines, end quote, held the existing state, he proclaimed, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen. Do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Yet semantics alone are insufficient to resolve the problem. In October 1871, according to Hunt, in an article in the New York World, when describing it as a, quote, proletarian dictature, and, quote, Marx all but called the Paris Commune a dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Moreover, in the Civil War, the book itself, Marx candidly declared that its, quote, secret was that it was, quote, essentially a working-class government, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor, end quote. Marx. Clearly, both models of the revolutionary state proffered by the Founding Fathers assumed the abolition, sooner or later, of state power per se. In Engels' famous maxim, quote, the administration of men will be replaced by the administration of things, end quote. Engels. Yet in other respects, they are profoundly different. The first model stressed a continuing role for strong centralized proletarian state power in the transition period, while the latter posited an immediate beginning to the dismantling of the state by a radical diffusion of power into the hands of the working population organized in its local communes. The problem, however, is not one merely of confusion. Marx's discussion of the commune state also suffered from a critical lacuna, singled out quite precisely by Hunt, in that he failed to provide any criteria to, quote, to delineate exactly which functions should devolve upon which levels of the administration, or specify any overall degree of centralization to be achieved, or suggest how the inevitable conflicts of and jurisdictional disputes among the various levels would be resolved, end quote. Hunt. A second, if less promising concern, is to reconstruct in detail how the left communists conceived of the politics of the transition period. This task is complicated by the fact, to which Neil Harding has recently drawn our attention, that before the October Revolution, none of them, not even their leading theorist on the state, Nikolai Bukharin, had drawn up a precise blueprint of the, quote, principles and forms of organization appropriate to the construction of socialism, end quote. Nevertheless, by drawing together the various references to this question made by them before and during 1917, supplemented by their political rhetoric in the spring of 1918 itself, it is possible to piece together the left communist vision of the institutional framework upon which the revolutionary socialist state was to be built. The first step in this investigation must of necessity refer again to their analysis of imperialism, in particular to what they believed to be the socio-political ramifications of the development of finance capitalism. As we saw in Chapter 2, Bukharin and others on the left had come to conclude that an integral part of, indeed the first essential stage in socialist revolution, was the smashing of the, quote, Leviathan finance capitalist state. On this, they were quite unequivocal. The question remains as to what they thought should take the place of the old state machine. In 1916, Bukharin began, so Michael Haynes has argued, to see a republic of Soviets as the, quote, embryonic form of proletarian state power, end quote. During 1917, the left generally was to advocate the transfer of power into their hands, despite some reservations in the summer when Bubnov condemned them as, quote, rotting, counter-revolutionary organs, and Bukharin himself more cautiously urged re-elections in order to transform them from petty bourgeois strongholds into genuine proletarian, quote, organs of class struggle, end quote. And once victorious, quote, organs of revolutionary power, end quote. Within the Soviets, the proletariat was to exercise the dominant role, albeit with the support of the poor peasants. Moreover, the Soviets were to create a popular militia so that the armed people would be able to exercise the coercive functions formerly performed by the old standing army and police. Disclaiming any accusations that they were anarchists, they were adamant on the need for a strong state during the transition to socialism until a classless and consequently stateless society would at last exist. For the left communists, the Soviet Republic was to be this state, identified Bukharin as, quote, the iron dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. This dictatorship had two basic functions, one political, the other economic. First, it must consolidate the gains of the revolution by ruthlessly stamping out all counter-revolutionary opposition on the part of the old exploiting classes. At the same time, it had a more constructive role to play. It had to act to save the Russian economy from complete collapse and the population, especially in the towns, from starvation. The intervention in the economy required to prevent such a collapse, labor conscription, was one measure necessary to achieve this end, if implemented by the provisional government, would serve simply to strengthen even more the development of state capitalism in Russia and its, quote, Leviathan state, and so only reinforce, quote, the cruelest form of class oppression, end quote. If introduced by a dictatorship of the proletariat, however, in the form of Soviet power, the measures needed to preserve and expand industrial and agrarian production at the same time would help to establish the foundations of the socialist economy and the society of the future, so, quote, bringing Russia closer to socialism, end quote. Rudimentary as the left communist conception of the new political order then was, they were insistent on one point. While emphasizing that some form of centralized administration would remain necessary in the revolutionary state, as their understanding of the economics of socialism unquestionably demanded, they also maintained, as Bukharin made clear, that, quote, it was totally without sense that one central, quote, Soviet of Soviets, end quote, in St. Petersburg could control everything, end quote, Bukharin. On the contrary, they envisaged a radical decentralization of power to the local Soviets. Such a diffusion of power would serve two interrelated purposes. It would help to destroy the highly centralized bureaucratic hierarchy of the old regime and the attitudes of deference nurtured by it. At the same time, it would provide the opportunity for the majority of the people to take an active part in the running of the new state, and so to learn the art of administration, quote, to use a slogan, end quote. Bukharin was sarcastically to remark in the spring of 1918, quote, which is formulated so splendidly by Lenin, end quote. Bukharin. A rather optimistic evaluation of the class consciousness of the proletariat led the left communists to conclude that the central, quote, guiding and unifying, end quote, institutions required in socialist society would emerge spontaneously from below as the workers themselves came to perceive the necessity of them. But as with their project for the organization of industry, so too there were serious lacunae in their political thinking. Quite how this process of centralization would occur, what was to be done should rank-and-file initiative fail to create the required central institutions, and how potential conflicts between the center and the localities were to be resolved. The answers to these questions were not spelled out in detail. Lacunae notwithstanding, in the spring of 1918, what the left communists understood to be essential to the politics of the transition period was much clarified. In the face of attempts by Lenin and his faction to limit the autonomy of the local Soviets, the left communists' theses on the current situation unequivocally defended the model of the, quote, commune state ruled from below as the only possible form, the quote, commune state ruled from below, end quote, as the only possible form of a revolutionary socialist state, only form a revolutionary socialist state to assume. Bukharin was even more explicit. In his review of State and Revolution, published in the first issue of Communist, effusive in his praise of the vision enshrined in it, he forthrightly concluded that, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not a parliamentary republic with all its trappings. It is the commune state, without the police, the standing army, the officialdom, etc., end quote. To understand more fully, however, how the left communists conceived of, quote, the commune state, end quote, it is necessary to turn to Lenin himself, who, as Harding has pointed out, during 1917, had come to articulate in more comprehensive and systematic manner the principles on which such a state was to be constructed. Until the second half of 1916, he appeared not to have given serious and consistent thought to the question of the form that the state must assume in post-revolutionary society. Till then, he had believed, like the majority of contemporary socialists, that, quote, the political form of society wherein the proletariat is victorious in overthrowing the bourgeoisie will be a democratic republic, end quote. During 1916 itself, in letters to A.G. Shliapnikov, G.E. Zinoviev, and Bukharin himself, Lenin had repeatedly denied that an essential precondition for the victory of socialist revolution was the destruction of the bourgeois state machine. Such a conclusion was, quote, not thought out, useless, end quote. Quote, the height of stupidity, a disgrace, end quote. Quote, semi-anarchism, end quote. As late as December of that year, in direct refutation of Bukharin, Lenin repeated that, quote, socialists are in favor of utilizing the present state in the struggle for the emancipation of the working class, end quote. That, quote, the bourgeois state should be utilized against the bourgeoisie to overthrow the bourgeoisie, end quote. Lenin. Yet, as intimated in Chapter 2, by February 1917, Lenin had undergone a radical conversion. At the end of 1916, prompted primarily by what Lenin believed to be the grave errors in Bukharin's analysis of the imperialist state, Lenin undertook an intensive study of the political prescriptions of the, quote, founding fathers, end quote. Lenin's purpose, as Lenin later admitted, was, quote, to reestablish what Marx had really taught on the subject of the state, end quote. Lenin. Intending to deploy his conclusions in condemnation of Bukharin, a rather surprised Lenin found himself compelled to accept much of Lenin's protagonist analysis. The thrust of his argument now was to be directed generally against the majority of socialists who thought to capture the old state machinery, possibly in a peaceful parliamentary manner, and employ it to introduce socialism by legislation. Lenin's particular target, as Alfred Evans recently emphasized, was Karl Kowalski, considered to be the greatest living authority on Marxism, but deemed by Lenin to be a, quote, renegade, guilty of betraying Marx's revolutionary credo. Lenin's new analysis of the nature of the state in the epoch of finance capitalism was almost identical to that of Bukharin. As is evident from State and Revolution, he had come to regard, quote, the state which is merging more and more with the all-powerful capitalist associations, end quote, as responsible for, quote, the monstrous oppression of the working people, ... end quote. Violent revolution was necessary to smash its power completely. From March in his draft theses and his letters from afar, Lenin began urgently to advocate such a course of action. Lenin now bluntly denied that the bourgeois state, quote, even a democratic bourgeois republican state, end quote, could be taken over intact by the proletariat and used to advance the cause of socialist revolution. In Lenin's April theses, Lenin was quite unequivocal, arguing that, quote, to return to a parliamentary republic, ... would be a retrograde step, ... end quote. Lenin. Casting aside whatever reservations Lenin may have harbored about the Soviets, Lenin called for the creation of a, quote, republic of Soviets, end quote, as, quote, the only possible form of revolutionary government, end quote. This new Soviet state, Lenin soon added, was to be built on the pattern of, quote, the commune in Marx's sense of the experience of 1871, end quote, and would serve as the dictatorship of the proletariat with, of course, the support of the peasants. Throughout 1917, Lenin continued to demand that the existing state be smashed and power transferred into the hands of the Soviets, with the well-known exception of several weeks after the July days when Lenin was convinced that, in the thrall of feckless Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, the Soviets had become nothing but, quote, organs collaborating with the bourgeoisie, end quote. But more than that, Lenin also strove to expound on the political structures appropriate for the new revolutionary Soviet state. He did so most fully in State and Revolution. Composed in the summer of 1917 when he was in hiding in Finland to escape the repression of the Bolsheviks, further apart in the July days, it was the fruit of his studies of the thinking of the, quote, founding fathers, end quote, on the state. recognized in recent Western scholarship as neither a, quote, utopian fantasy, end quote, nor a purely anarchist treatise, negating the need for strong centralized state power in the transition to socialism. Nevertheless, it, quote, does represent the high watermark of Lenin's optimism concerning the merits of mass initiative in building the new society, end quote. As such, it was also to bring him close to, quote, the aspirations of left Bolsheviks, end quote, and in fact go beyond them, quote, to specify the positive content of socialism itself, end quote. A convoluted and repetitive work replete with quotations from Marx and Engels, State and Revolution marked an attempt by Lenin to draw together ideas propounded at various times earlier in the year as he sought to define, quote, what was to take the place of the state machine to be destroyed, end quote. Reiterating that the prototype of the, quote, specific, end quote, form of the proletarian socialist republic, end quote, was the Paris Commune, he again called for the abolition of the oppressive agencies of the old state, the police, and the standing army. They were to be replaced by a popular militia drawn from the workers and peasants. Similarly, the, quote, privileged civilian bureaucracy, separate from and standing above the people, was to be dismantled root and branch. In its place, the working people, quote, each in turn, end quote, was to take a direct and active part in running the new state, and in so doing, quote, learn the art of administration, end quote. Lenin. The institutional mechanism for popular participation on this scale was to be the Soviets. Conceived after the model of the Commune, the Soviets were to be composed of democratically elected and revocable representatives performing executive as well as legislative functions. Mass participation, Lenin optimistically added, was not at all utopian. Capitalism, in capitalism's contemporary imperialist form, had developed sufficiently to create, quote, the preconditions that enable, really, quote, all to take part in the administration of the state, end quote. In particular, the positive functions of the state, the administration of, quote, large-scale production, factories, railways, the postal service, telephones, etc. And on this basis, the great majority of the functions of the old, quote, state power, end quote, have become so simplified and can be reduced to such exceedingly simple operations of registration, filing, and checking that they can be easily performed by every literate person, can quite easily be performed by ordinary, quote, can easily be performed for ordinary, quote, workmen's wages, end quote, and that these functions can and must be stripped of every shadow of privilege, of every semblance of, quote, official grandeur, end quote. Lenin, State and Revolution. The emphasis here on mass initiative appears also to have been based on Lenin's growing appreciation during 1917 of the potential abilities of ordinary working people, and on Lenin's increasing antipathy to, quote, foolish bureaucratic prejudices, czarist red tapeism, reactionary professorial ideas as to the indispensability of bureaucratism, end quote. During the April conference, for instance, Lenin singled out for praise the example given by a group of miners who had proved themselves to be perfectly capable of maintaining production on their own initiative. Both before and as we shall see after October, Lenin was to return to this theme, frequently defending the competence of rank-and-file workers and peasants, too, to run the state and the economy. Their talents to do so, admittedly, still lay, quote, dormant, but they would blossom once they were given the opportunity to exercise them. In keeping with his newfound faith in the, quote, direct initiative of the people from below in their local areas, end quote, State and Revolution also posited a radical devolution of power to the local Soviets of workers and peasants. Such a diffusion of power, however, would not be tantamount either to federalism or to the elimination of centralized state power, which would remain an essential feature of the revolutionary dictatorship. Yet, like those on the left of the party, he too was rather vague about how the central organs of the new state would emerge, rather lamely concluding that they would be created spontaneously from below on the initiative of the proletariat and poor peasants. This system of, quote, voluntary centralism, end quote, of the voluntary fusion of the proletarian communes, end quote, he insisted would, quote, not in the least preclude a broad local self-government, end quote. Lenin. The revolutionary dictatorship so constituted, quote, the proletariat armed and organized as the ruling class, end quote, had two principal functions. The first, to, quote, crush the inevitable position of the old, quote, exploiters. The second, more positive task, quote, to lead the enormous mass of the population, in the work of organizing a socialist economy, end quote, which alone, so Lenin was convinced, could combat the growing economic chaos within the country. While conceding that of necessity the revolutionary dictatorship would persist throughout, quote, the entire historical period, the entire historical period which separates capitalism from, quote, classless society, end quote, from communism, end quote, Lenin hastily added that it would no longer be, quote, the state proper, end quote, a, quote, special force, end quote, of the, quote, privileged minority, end quote, for the suppression of the majority of the people. Following in the tradition of the, quote, founding fathers, end quote, on the nature of the state, Lenin argued that the majority could not suppress itself. In post-revolutionary society, which would witness the gradual transcendence of class antagonisms, there would ultimately be no need for any form of state at all. Consequently, even the revolutionary state itself would begin to wither away, and he emphasized, quote, so constituted, bracket, as the communist state, in bracket, it begins to wither away immediately, end quote. Yet even in State and Revolution, Lenin displayed some hesitation. For Lenin, there could be, quote, no question of the specifying, be no question of specifying the moment of the future, end quote. I fucked that up. For Lenin, there could be, quote, no question of specifying the moment of the future, quote, withering away, end quote. The more so since it would obviously be a lengthy process, end quote, of a, quote, protracted nature, end quote. The final, quote, withering away, end quote, of the state required that the economy develops to such levels that, quote, the antithesis between mental and manual labor disappears, one of the principal sources of modern social inequality, which cannot on any account be removed immediately by the mere conversion of the means of production into public property by the mere expropriation of the capitalist, end quote. Lenin. Similarly, Lenin qualified his remarks regarding the abolition of bureaucracy. It too was destined to experience, quote, a gradual withering away, to the gradual creation of an order, under which the functions of control and accounting, becoming more and more simple, will be performed by each in turn, will then become a habit, and will finally die out as the special functions of a special section of the population, end quote. But again, Lenin insisted that the immediate elimination of all bureaucracy was utopian. Whilst capitalism had, quote, simplified the functions of, quote, state administration, end quote, Lenin was emphatic that some form of, quote, administration and, quote, subordination remained vital since, quote, people as they are now cannot dispense with subordination, control, and, quote, foremen and accountants, end quote, Lenin. A role clearly remained for, quote, state officials, as responsible, revocable, modestly paid, quote, foremen and accountants, end quote, of course with the aid of technicians of all sorts, types, and degrees, end quote. Lenin. Reiterating several times the indispensability of a, quote, scientifically trained staff, end quote, of administrators in the post-revolutionary state, he nevertheless insisted that they be paid only, quote, workmen's wages, end quote, to remove the material bases for bureaucratic careerism. Equally, they would remain responsible for their actions, quote, to the armed vanguard of all the exploited and working people, i.e., to the proletariat, end quote, and subject to instant dismissal for any malfeasance. In light of the above, one can readily accept Evans' conclusion that State and Revolution was not simply a work of, quote, quasi-anarchic utopianism, end quote, but on the contrary itself was, quote, filled with ambiguities, equivocations, and inconsistencies, end quote. Yet it was not necessarily viewed as such at the time, or for long thereafter. To Lenin's contemporaries, its emphasis was understood to be on the necessity of smashing the old political order and all the features characteristic of the old political order, such as the centralized and hierarchical bureaucratic system of administration. This is to be replaced by self-administration by the majority, the only means whereby it would gain the requisite experience to run the state. It was this image of state and revolution that the left communists lauded, as it coincided with their own vision of the extensive diffusion and decentralization of power in socialist society. The problem, however, that confronted the Bolsheviks after the Bolsheviks assumed power was that political reality within Soviet Russia in the months following the revolution belied the hopes the Bolsheviks had pinned on mass initiative in the construction of the new revolutionary state, far from leading to the spontaneous creation of a, quote, iron dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. The transfer of power to the Soviets, on the contrary, had resulted, as Onweiler pointed out, in, quote, the formation of semi-independent republics, autonomous regions, etc., end quote. In face of the grave threats of the infant Soviet Republic, in face of the grave threats to the infant Soviet Republic posed by ever-growing economic disintegration and military opposition, internal and external, the absence of any, quote, kind of effective central authority, end quote, so E.H. Carr argued, jeopardized the very survival of the revolution. In these circumstances, its restoration seemed to be imperative. Initially, Lenin's own response to this situation was hesitant. In the first months after the October Revolution, in the main, Lenin appears to have kept faith in the capacities of rank-and-file workers to administer the state. In January 1918, at the Third Congress of the Soviets, Lenin continued to defend the model of the communist state as appropriate for Soviet Russia. Quote, of course, Lenin admitted, quote, the working people had no experience in government, but that does not scare us. ... For in the working people lie dormant the great forces of revolution, Renaissance, renovation, end quote. Lenin. At the same time, Lenin continued to attribute the bulk of the problems, especially the economic problems afflicting the country, to counter-revolutionary sabotage, not to the foibles of, quote, the working people, end quote. Yet gradually, Lenin's attitude to the role of mass initiative became considerably more ambivalent. In early March, at the 17th Extraordinary Party Congress, on one occasion, Lenin summoned the, quote, party, ... the entire vanguard of the class-conscious proletariat, end quote, to be ruthless in the party's efforts to, quote, create everywhere soundly coordinated mass organizations held together by a single iron will, end quote. Lenin. Lenin quickly qualified this call to the vanguard, however, stressing the need, quote, to draw literally working people into the government of the state. It is a task of tremendous difficulty, but socialism cannot be implemented by a minority, by the party. Socialism can be implemented only by tens of millions when they have learned to do it themselves, end quote. Lenin. Soon afterwards, however, in the face of virtual anarchy in much of the country, Lenin's position was to become markedly less ambivalent. By the end of March, just as Lenin had regarding the administration of industry, Lenin demanded a return to, quote, business-like methods, end quote, in state administration too, and end to, quote, the overlapping of authority and irresponsibility, bracket, within the Soviets, end bracket, from which we are suffering incredibly at the present time, ... end quote. Lenin. This confusion had transformed, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat, ... into something as amorphous as jelly, end quote. Lenin. Coercion was required not just against, quote, our enemies, end quote, but also, quote, all waverers and harmful elements in our midst, end quote. Lenin. If order and discipline were to be restored, quote, the revolution, end quote, Lenin concluded, would be crushed if, quote, we do not counter ruin, disorganization, and despair with the iron dictatorship of class-conscious workers, end quote. Lenin. Lenin had now begun to distance himself quite self-consciously from the vision of popular participation in the administration of the revolutionary state that Lenin had proffered in State and Revolution. Lenin reverted to a more authoritarian strand also present even in State and Revolution itself in Lenin's political thinking in 1917, if then in largely muted form. Most clearly evident perhaps in Can the Bolsheviks Retain State Power? Lenin there posited a rather different, more circumscribed role for mass initiative. Lenin dismisses quite utopian the idea, quote, that an unskilled laborer or cook could get on with the job of state administration, end quote. Lenin. The best that could be achieved, Lenin claimed, was that, quote, a beginning be made at once in training all the working people, all the poor for this work, end quote. Lenin. Again emphasizing the vital need in the post-revolutionary period for a centralized dictatorial state, on this occasion Lenin omitted any discussion of, quote, voluntary centralism, end quote, of centralized power being constructed from the grassroots up on the initiative of rank-and-file workers and peasants. The leading role in establishing this dictatorship and in educating the majority in the work of administration was assigned to the, quote, class-conscious workers and soldiers, end quote. As he began to despair increasingly during the spring of 1918 of the abilities of ordinary working people to participate effectively in the work of state administration, even complaining of their, quote, timidity, end quote, their belief that, quote, the only people capable of governing were their, quote, betters, end quote, end quote. Lenin again elevated, quote, the disciplined and class-conscious vanguard of the proletariat, end quote, the party, to the leading role within the revolutionary state. The party alone, Lenin now asserted, had the political nous, N-O-U-S, to run the state. Yet reliance upon the, quote, vanguard, end quote, raised another problem. The party itself simply did not possess skilled administrators, political as well as economic, in sufficient numbers to cope with the range of tasks before it. Consequently, Lenin was forced to concede that there was little choice but to employ the bureaucracy from the old regime to assist the party in restoring order to the state administration. The need to do so was so great in Lenin's eyes that despite bitter criticisms from the left communists, Lenin professed his willingness to, quote, compromise, the principles of the Paris Commune, and, quote, pay a very high price for the, quote, services of the top bourgeois experts, end quote. A clear retreat from the egalitarianism enshrined in state and revolution, but one which had been one which had been hinted at in Can the Bolsheviks Retain State Power? Rather ironically, Lenin's renewed concern for efficient administration and Lenin's determination to restore efficient administration at virtually any cost was to lead Lenin to preserve the old bureaucratic apparatus in substantial part intact. The eventual outcome of his emphasis on restoring order and authority within the Soviet Republic was to be an ever greater centralization of power in the hands of Sovnarkom, dominated by the party leadership, and of the spawning bureaucracy that it was to control. This concentration of power, of course, as Carr aptly commented, can only take place, quote, at the expense of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets and the VTSIK, and of the local Soviets and Congresses of Soviets and their organs. End quote. Carr. E.H. Carr. The left communists themselves are all too aware, as their theses made clear, that the conduct of politics within Soviet Russia in the spring of 1918 was increasingly diverging from the vision of Soviet power that they nurtured in 1917. Unlike Lenin, however, they remained vehemently opposed to the all too perceptible trend towards the recrudescence of a hierarchical centralized bureaucracy, in large part drawn from the old officialdom, which was unreflective of and unresponsive to rank-and-file aspirations. If continued, this trend could only stifle local initiative and deny the workers the opportunity to, quote, learn the art of administration, end quote. Effective mass participation in the administration, as essential politically as economically for the construction of socialism, would be stymied with only one possible outcome, the degeneration of the revolution. Of all the left communists, it was perhaps Vladimir Sorin who presented the most compelling analysis of the roots of the political degeneration evident within the infant Soviet Republic. Given the paucity of experienced administrators amongst party members and the working class more generally, many who staffed the new state administration of necessity, he conceded, had to be drawn from the ranks of the old bourgeois intelligentsia. Moreover, it had been necessary, too, to seek recruits from the, quote, semi-intelligentsia of, quote, clerks, secretaries, minor officials, and others, end quote, who had played little prominent role in the old regime, since a substantial part of the better trained personnel had refused to work for the Soviet regime. Imbued with the habits of the past, they had agreed to serve the revolutionary state solely from motives of personal gain. They were driven primarily by the desire to preserve their position and the material privileges which flowed from them, such as higher salaries, and not the least important in the spring of 1918, an adequate supply of food. The politics of socialism, which demanded they should be responsible and accountable to the Soviets per se, was completely anathema to them. Hence they sought every opportunity to escape such accountability and to return to their traditional authoritarian and bureaucratic ways. Sadly, and much more disturbing, the experienced party workers who had been recruited in droves to man the new state apparatus, in order to provide the state apparatus with at least a leavening of revolutionary consciousness, had been unable to counter these forces of reaction entrenched within it. Worn out by the travails of revolutionary life, all they sought now was peace and quiet, the opportunity to relax and enjoy the fruits of their labors. Misguidedly, they believed that the new direction in Lenin's overall policy, one of compromise if possible with the bourgeoisie, promised to ensure that this was possible. For them, the heroic period of revolutionary assault and socialist construction was over. The solution to this problem of the revival of bureaucratism proposed by Sorin was twofold. First, the Soviets themselves, the institutions deemed to be representative of the, quote, broad working masses, end quote, were to be reinvigorated. Precisely how was not explained in detail, on the assumption that the Soviets, more than the officials employed by the Soviets, were more reliable repositories of revolutionary elan. The strengthening of their authority and control over their bureaucracies would ensure, he believed, that the latter served the revolution, and not their own narrow self-interest. One particular measure which would help to realize this end, Surin added, very much in the spirit of the Paris Commune, was the elimination of all, quote, privileges for, quote, public workers. Surin, however, was not yet finished. Quote, the left communists, Sorin continued, quote, were the most passionate proponents of Soviet power, but only so far as this power does not degenerate in a petty bourgeois direction, end quote. Surin. The Soviets themselves, Surin argued, were representative of the working people in general, including the, quote, petty bourgeois peasantry, end quote, as well as the proletariat. As such, they were vulnerable to corruption and demoralizing influences that might dilute their socialist zeal. The only true bastion of the interest of the proletariat was the party, which, quote, is in every case and everywhere superior to the Soviets. Is in every case and everywhere superior to the Soviets, end quote. Surin. Its role was to act as the watchdog which would ensure that the Soviets, in fact, quote, implemented an undeviating proletarian line in foreign and domestic policy, end quote. A line presumably identical with that advocated by the left communists themselves. Ironically, Surin's call for a revived Soviet democracy is becoming vitiated by the dominant role assigned in the final analysis to the party. And in practice, according to one Menshevik observer, David Dahlin, some of his comrades, such as those in Saratov, sought to purge the Soviets of all non-Bolshevik, quote, petty bourgeois, and, quote, elements, actions which are difficult to reconcile with, quote, a passionate defense of real Soviet power. Surin's reliance on the party to safeguard the integrity of the revolution, however, did not go unchallenged. A number of Surin's comrades, including leading left communists such as Bukharin, Osinsky, and Radek, as well as less prominent figures from Petrograd and the northern region, expressed grave reservations regarding the conditions of the party itself. No longer was it solely a party of the proletariat. Rather, as it had grown rapidly during 1917, especially after the Kornilov affair, it had degenerated into a, quote, national party, permeated with non-proletarian elements, in particular peasants and soldiers, quote, peasants in uniform, and, quote, considered by the left communists, as we have seen in Chapter 4, to be hostile to socialism. Moreover, it had also been weakened by the exodus of a vast number of old party workers who had left to take up positions within the state administration. The only solution in these circumstances, if the party was to be able to ensure that, quote, undeviating socialist politics were put into practice, was in effect to purge it of all these alien elements and restore it to its pristine condition. The problem remained, however, of defining what were proletarian and conversely what were non-proletarian elements. Social origin or former occupation were clearly insufficient, as the left communists were critical of the conduct of many worker Bolsheviks who had entered the state administration, as we have just seen. Ultimately, the only criterion that they appeared able to offer was to define, quote, proletarian, end quote, in terms of adherence to their own policy prescriptions, and, quote, non-proletarian by non-adherence to them. In consequence, all who dared to oppose them could be accused either of being non-proletarian or at the very least of suffering from some form of, quote, false consciousness, end quote, and in the interest of building socialism must recant or be purged from the party. Rather ironically, beneath the surface of their fine rhetoric in defense of the Soviets and of the party as a, quote, forum for all proletarian democracy, end quote, there lay a political philosophy that was arguably as authoritarian as that of which they accused Lenin and his faction. The purge of the party that the left communists demanded was in fact initiated by the Central Committee in the latter half of May. In this case, the irony was that in part it was directed against the left communists themselves, who were accused of contributing to the disorganization evident within the party by their continuing opposition, and we have seen in Chapter 1 an indeterminate number of their supporters were expelled in consequence. New section. Immediately related to the left communist opposition to the reemergence of a hierarchic, centralized bureaucratic state was their criticism of what they saw as, quote, a deviation, end quote, in the military policy that the Soviet government began to introduce in the spring of 1918. Then, Lenin abandoned his oft-repeated commitment to the creation of a popular militia, one of the foundations on which Lenin had claimed Soviet power was to be built. Now Lenin came around to support Leon Trotsky, who insisted that any realistic defense of the revolution demanded the recreation of a new regular conscript army, even more heinous from the point of view of the left, one staffed by appointees from the old officer corps willing to collaborate with the Soviet regime. Harsh reality again lay at the root of Lenin's apostasy. The old imperial army, while broadly sympathetic to Soviet power, was fast disintegrating, the result of war weariness, the burning desire to return to the countryside to share in the new land settlement, and of Bolshevik anti-militarist propaganda itself. As a fighting force, it was useless, but the expectations of the Bolsheviks that a new volunteer army, drawn from the ranks of the workers and poor peasants, would soon form were to be disappointed. The reliance on the volunteer principle failed in the main to produce the anticipated results, despite a perceptible if still modest rise in recruits in face of the renewed German advance in the final days of February. Moreover, the effectiveness of the units that did exist was vitiated both by the lack of effective leadership and by the absence of any overall command structure, as the local and regional Soviets resisted the efforts of the center to coordinate the activity of their forces on a national scale. The result, unsurprisingly, was one of virtual military anarchy and weakness, as witnessed by the ineffectual resistance of the German advance both in the Western Front and in the Ukraine. Fear of a fresh attack by German or Allied imperialism, as well as the threat posed by the growing forces of counter-revolution organizing across Russia itself, made continuation of this situation untenable. The appointment of Trotsky as president of the Supreme War Council on the 4th of March, and then as Commissar for War on the 8th of April, signaled a new departure in military policy. During the spring of 1918, Trotsky strove to build a new regular army organized on conventional lines, which alone, Trotsky was convinced, could provide an effective defense for the revolution. This required the gradual introduction of conscription, the creation of a single, unified, hierarchical command structure, and the replacement of elected officers by military spetsy, officers of the old imperial army, to provide efficient professional leadership. This new orientation in military policy provoked great furor among the left communists, and also, it seems, within many units of the then slowly forming Red Army, which continued to insist that a truly socialist army could be built only on the volunteer principle, the election of officers in a decentralized command structure. They are certain that general conscription, especially combined with the reemployment of the old officer corps, could only lead to the degeneration of the army into a weapon of counter-revolution. Indeed, even during the parlous days of the renewed German advance into Russia, they had disclaimed the need to create a regular army to defend the revolution. Instead, the Soviet government should call to arms revolutionary detachments, otriadi, of workers and peasants to wage a guerrilla war behind the lines of the advancing Germans, and so, they rather blithely claimed, after the first inevitable defeats, halt them. Osinski developed this strand in left communist thinking to its logical if extreme conclusion. In the course of civil war, Osinski contended, be it against the forces of the world imperialism or of counter-revolution within Russia, a partisan army would arise spontaneously from the ranks of the workers and peasants. This army, Osinski was confident, would suffice in the interim until the revolution became victorious internationally, whence the need for an army of any sort, as for the other trappings of state power, would wither away. In the spring, the left communists continued to rail against the creation of a new regular army constructed on conventional lines, as Trotsky was proposing, alleging that the Soviet government remained trapped by bourgeois conceptions of war, which were quite inappropriate for a revolutionary socialist state. Radek perhaps elaborated most fully their objections to Trotsky's plans. Radek began on a conciliatory note, conceding that Trotsky was correct in urging the establishment of a much larger army. This was vital not so much to combat counter-revolution within Russia itself. Partisan detachments would be sufficient for this purpose, provided the mass of the population continued to support the Bolshevik government. But to defend the revolution against the pretensions of world imperialism, most recently evidenced in Japan's thrust into Siberia. Moreover, when the much-heralded European Revolution did in fact break out, then the, quote, Red Revolutionary Army, end quote, must be ready to advance to assist its comrades there. For Radek, the issue is not one of building a new army or not, but the question of, quote, how to construct the Red Army, end quote. Radek welcomed the decision of the government on the 22nd of April not to mobilize the bourgeoisie for military service, as Trotsky and N.I. Podvoisky had proposed. To do so would not only have armed potential opponents of the revolution, but would also have eroded the revolutionary class character of the new army, but he warned the construction of a regular army, even one composed solely of workers and peasants, had its own perils. Any regular army had the tendency to become, quote, detached from its social base, end quote, and transformed into a quote, special caste, end quote, with its own particular, quote, psychology and special interests. Even a new class-based Red Army would not be immune from this tendency. The danger would be even greater if it was staffed by members of the old officer corps. By no means convinced that they had been won over to the side of the revolution, he feared that they would subvert its revolutionary ethos and convert it into a conventional army of the, quote, old bourgeois variety and divert it from its revolutionary tasks. To prevent such, quote, degeneration, end quote, it was essential to train officers from the ranks of the proletariat itself as quickly as possible, a training which he admitted required the cooperation of the old military spezi, but this measure was in itself still insufficient to counter the possible growth of military separatism. To ensure that the newly forming army remained true to its revolutionary purpose, and maintained its links with the working population, its, quote, chief purpose, end quote, must it be to elucidate the workers and peasants in the arts of warfare, to act as the cadres would around which a genuine trained people's militia would grow. Then, of course, it would be feasible to rouse the population en masse to wage a really offensive partisan war. In the final analysis, the only sure means to secure the revolution against any military threat. Lenin, it appears, was totally unconvinced. Skeptical of the virtues of partisan war during the Brest-Litovsk debate, he became more and more certain that it was, quote, absurd to rely on guerrilla war to defend the revolution. The continuing isolation of the revolution and the growing range of military challenges facing Soviet Russia from within and without led Lenin to have little patience for the solutions proposed by the left communists. Increasingly, Lenin threw his political weight behind Trotsky and supported the rapid buildup of a conventional army. As with the economy and the state, so too the army was to become highly centralized, with control in the hands of the government in Moscow. New section. Just as the exigencies of burgeoning civil war intervention militated against the adoption of the militia model in the organization of the Red Army, so too one must concede that Soviet Russia in the first half of 1918 was not the ideal laboratory in which to experiment with the participatory democratic form of socialist politics. The proletariat remained a minority in a vast ocean of peasants. Of the proletariat itself, a substantial part remained politically and culturally backward. Moreover, it was increasingly prey to the growing shortages of food and fuel, which accelerated the disintegration of the urban economy, already in evidence before the revolution. Hunger, cold, and unemployment contributed to the, quote, declassing of the Russian proletariat as workers, in their tens and then hundreds of thousands, fled back to the shelter of the countryside where subsistence, at least, promised to be secured more easily. Moreover, many others, often young workers recruited mainly from the ranks of the most skilled and politically conscious, who had been the most active supporters of the Bolsheviks in 1917, were mobilized into the Red Army to combat the growing threat posed by the forces of counter-revolution and intervention. In these circumstances of the increasing fragmentation of the working class, any attempts to devolve power into the hands of the proletariat would have proved to be problematic. However, the failure of the Bolsheviks to construct a democratic polity cannot be attributed simply and solely to socioeconomic obstacles, no matter how real they were. First, and the issue perhaps most easily dealt with, there was a glaring contradiction in the overall conception of how socialism was to be constructed. As we saw in the preceding chapter, the Bolsheviks' understanding of the economics of socialism inexorably demanded that the regulation of production be placed in the hands of a centralized bureaucracy. The question of how their commitment to economic centralization was to be reconciled with a highly decentralized political system was never adequately answered. Again, the logic of their thinking, the left communists as well as Lenin's, pointed in the direction of the circumscription of the powers of the local Soviets when they failed, as they must, to act in accord with the interests of the, quote, general will. But there were other reasons why the Bolsheviks would have found it difficult to devolve power fully to the Soviets. Even had Russia been an advanced capitalist society, with an extensive and highly developed industry and a large educated, cultured working class, not one in which the proletarian base of the regime was rapidly eroding problems would have remained. In particular, the historical record indicates that nowhere has a unified, homogeneous proletariat appeared, conscious of its mission to bring about socialist revolution and so obliterate all humanity from its chains. As Edward Thompson has remarked, the proletariat is a, quote, real, observable, historical, end quote, phenomenon, rather than as a, quote, analytic category, end quote, has remained divided into divergent strata, most of which have lacked the revolutionary consciousness imputed to them by Marxist tradition. At best, this class consciousness has been the property of a particular group within the proletariat as a whole, which can only realize the libertarian vision of socialism depicted in Marxism by imposing its will on its more, quote, backward comrades, and as Mihaly Riley commented, forcing them to be free. The Bolsheviks themselves proposed no practical solution to this dilemma, or more precisely, no democratic solution. At first sight, State and Revolution and many of Lenin's writings in 1917 and early 1918 emphasizing the vital role of mass initiative in the administration of the revolutionary state, appear to offer what Siriani, I think it's supposed to be Siriani, has characterized as a, quote, profoundly popular and participatory, end quote, model for the politics of the transition period. But, as well as severely underestimating the complexity of administration in modern industrial society, the talent for which all do not share equally as yet, even at this time, Lenin's subscription to a seemingly ultra-democratic form of politics is deceptive. As Polan recently reminded us, quote, administration concerns the carrying out of an already determined policy. Politics involves the discussion and negotiation of such policies, end quote. Polan, arguably steeped in Marxist tradition, his understanding of politics led him to conclude that the political sphere proper was confined, quote, to the struggle between classes, end quote. If so, there could be no genuine political differences within the proletariat itself. This view helps explain why Lenin failed to address adequately the real problems of proletarian heterogeneity. The fact that the proletariat has not been a united, politically conscious, quote, class for itself, end quote, collectively capable of articulating an agreed set of policies. This failure, in its turn, meant that he neglected the need to elaborate on an institutional model which could resolve in a democratic manner the inevitable conflicts over policy that would arise in the ranks of the proletariat itself. The problem then remains to determine who, or what was ultimately to decide policy. As 1918 unfolded, Lenin's answer, as we have seen, was to become clear, harking back to the philosophy expounded in What is to be Done, and to the one fleeting reference in State and Revolution. Decision-making power was to be concentrated in the hands of the party, and the Constitution of the Russian Socialist Federal Soviet Republic, adopted in July 1918, so Mark Farrow pointed out, recognized. As the future of Soviet Russia was to reveal, this answer would lead in practice to a party-dominated bureaucratic dictatorship over the proletariat. It was to be a dictatorship, moreover, whose powers were untrammeled as, quote, the conflation of politics and administration, end quote, which flowed from Lenin's advocacy of the fusion of legislative and executive functions, meant that there could be no checks on it from the autonomous forces of civil society. The notion still persists that somehow the left communists were different, less authoritarian, more democratic. Lenin's most savage critic of late, Polan, has praised them for their opposition to the substitution of party for class, while conceding that this choice doomed them to, quote, utopian politics and historical, quote, irrelevance. Yet, as we have seen, such a conclusion is simply wrong. Despite their professed commitment to mass participation in state administration and to democracy within the Soviets and the party, the left communists too failed to provide a blueprint which could reconcile disputes within the proletariat in a democratic manner. Implicit in their critique of the political degeneration evident within the infant Soviet Republic was the suggestion that only, quote, true proletarians, organized in a cleansed party and elevated above the Soviets, could in the final analysis be entrusted with power. Otherwise, the construction of socialism would be perverted. Within 2 years in his seminal work, The Politics and Economics of the Transition Period, Bukharin was to take this suggestion to its logical and explicit conclusion. Recognizing that in truth the proletariat was not a, quote, cohesive, class-conscious monolith, Bukharin frankly admitted that its less advanced elements would have to be subject to some form of coercion by the state, until such a time as it was re-educated politically to the requisite level of consciousness by the communist vanguard. Despite tendentiously arguing that such, quote, compulsion was equivalent, in fact, to the, quote, self-coercion of the working class, and, quote, the conclusion is inescapable. At the heart of the politics of the left communists, with a few honorable exceptions such as Preobrazhensky, who apparently argued in the late spring of 1918 that the party be disbanded, lay an authoritarianism no less profound than that which they imputed to Lenin. That's the end of chapter 6. Thank you so much for listening.